After an exhausting shift, a nurse decides to help a wounded man abandoned in the darkness, without imagining that this impulsive gesture will drag her into a universe where trust, fear, and survival walk side by side. What seemed to be just an act of compassion toward a stranger on the brink of death soon transforms into a dangerous connection with someone surrounded by secrets, power, and enemies willing to do anything. Between hiding places, pursuits, and decisions that could cost her own life, she discovers that some choices change destiny so profoundly that there is no longer a way back. And when the danger stops coming only from the outside and begins to touch the heart, she realizes that saving that man may have been the beginning of the greatest loss or the greatest turning point of her life. Before diving into this intense story of courage, risk, and forbidden feelings, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next reports. The rain fell over São Paulo that Thursday, as if the sky had decided to wash the city once and for all. Mariana Fontes left through the side door of the Hospital das Clínicas at 11:40 at night, with her bag on her shoulder and her feet aching inside her soaked white sneakers. 12 hours of duty in the emergency room left any human being with the sensation of having been squeezed by something much larger than themselves. She crossed the parking lot without caring about the rain, already resigned to the moisture that had penetrated even the second layer of her clothing. The bus she would take on Doutor Arnaldo would stop in front of her building in Sumaré, and from there it was only 3 blocks. 3 blocks that, on that night, seemed at once the shortest and the longest journey in the world. Mariana was 32 years old and had lived alone for 4 years in that 2-bedroom apartment that was too big for one person and too small to store everything she still needed to process about her own life. She was the head nurse of the trauma sector, a choice made not out of abstract vocation, but because since she was 17, she understood the human body as a language that deserved to be taken seriously. Her colleagues called her precise. Her patients, when they emerged from critical condition and managed to speak, sometimes called her an angel, and she always looked away when she heard that, because angel was a word that promised too much and explained too little. The bus arrived 8 minutes late and was fuller than it should have been for that hour. She stood holding the metal bar with her left hand, looking through the foggy window at the still intense flow of the city. São Paulo never truly slept. It just changed shifts, replaced one type of movement with another, like an organism that could not stop without collapsing. She got off at the Sumaré stop and began to walk. The rain had diminished to a fine drizzle that enveloped the lampposts in an orange halo. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour, most windows dark, only a few bars closing their gates with the metallic noise she had already learned to associate with the end of the day. She was thinking about a hot shower, the yogurt left in the fridge, the series she had paused 3 episodes ago and probably wouldn't finish this week, when she heard the sound. It was low, almost swallowed by the drizzle, and the distant noise of a truck on the parallel avenue. A groan, or something very much like a groan. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. The logic of any sensible person said to keep walking. It was almost midnight in São Paulo. The sound came from inside an alley between 2 closed commercial buildings, one of those spaces the city creates by oversight and that no one claims. Mariana stood still for perhaps 5 seconds, which felt like much longer, and then committed what she would later describe to herself as the greatest error of judgment of her life, which in truth was no error of judgment at all. It was simply who she was. She entered the alley. The cell phone light revealed a man on the ground, large, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark shirt that was soaked in a way that was wrong for it to be just rain. He was on his side, with one hand pressed against his left flank, his breathing irregular and his eyes half open. When the beam of light reached him, he reacted, tried to lift his head, and in that movement she had already automatically done what she did by reflex. Primary assessment. Airway compromised. No. Breathing present. Irregular. Circulation compromised, possibly. Level of consciousness altered, yes. She knelt beside him without thinking. He murmured something she didn't understand immediately. Then, with a visible effort, he repeated more clearly, "Don't call anyone, no hospital, no police, please." Mariana looked at his face. He was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features, an old scar on his right eyebrow. His eyes, even in that state, had a quality she couldn't name at the time, a kind of tense and absolute control that coexisted with the obvious fragility of his body. He was a man who was not used to being on the ground. "Please," he repeated. She knew that was irrational. She knew there were at least 6 hospital protocols that the situation violated. She knew the correct thing was to call SAMU and step away. She knew all of this in the same way that sometimes she knew that the right decision was not the only one possible. "How far can you walk?" she asked. He took a moment. Then he said, "Enough, if you help me." Mariana placed his arm over her own shoulders and began to lift. He weighed almost double her weight and made the effort with the restraint of someone accustomed to not showing pain. They left the alley together, slowly, like 2 acquaintances returning from somewhere that neither would know how to explain. The drizzle continued falling over the indifferent city while she took him to the only place she had, her own apartment. Mariana's apartment had that specific tidiness of someone who has lived alone long enough to create their own system and would find any intervention in it strange. Books stacked by subject on the living room shelves, a cactus on the windowsill that she mentally nicknamed Resistant because it resisted her own negligence, and a kitchen that revealed someone who cooked well when they had time, which was almost never. It was an apartment that smelled of eucalyptus and old coffee, and she had stopped noticing that years ago. She placed him on the sofa with the help of a silent mutual effort, and he did not complain, did not say a word about the absurd situation they were in. He lay on his side while she went to the bathroom to get the emergency kit that any self-respecting nurse keeps at home: gauze, saline, tape, disposable gloves, injectable analgesic, emergency suture material. She returned with everything on a blue plastic tray and turned on the floor lamp that gave better visibility than the ceiling light. "I'm going to need to see the wound," she said, in the same tone she used at work, direct and with no room for negotiation. He didn't respond with words. He just loosened the buttons of his shirt with fingers that trembled slightly, the only concession his body made to the state it was in. The open shirt revealed 2 wounds in the left flank, both penetrating, and she recognized the pattern without needing an explanation. They weren't accidents. They were wounds caused by fragments of something that had entered with force and speed. Mariana put on the gloves and began the work. He remained silent during almost the entire process. Only once, when she cleaned the second wound with more pressure than expected, did he emit a low and controlled sound, like someone who learned that showing pain is information that can be used against you. She didn't comment. She continued working. She performed the antisepsis, closed what she could close without surgical equipment, and applied the dressings with the precision that 12 years of practice confer on any gesture. When she finished, he was pale in a way that wasn't just fluid loss. There was something deeper there, an exhaustion that didn't just come from the body. "You lost a lot of blood," she said. "I need to know your blood type." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still didn't know how to name, and then said, "AB negative." Mariana stayed quiet for 2 seconds. AB negative was one of the rarest types that existed. It represented less than 1% of the Brazilian population. She knew this because it was her own type. She had discovered it at 20 years old during a voluntary donation, and since then carried that information like one carries a useless detail that might one day be useful. That day had arrived in a way she never would have predicted. She did the calculations mentally. He needed replacement. She was healthy, had eaten a few hours before, and had enough basic equipment for an emergency collection at the limit of what was reasonable. It was a procedure she had seen done in the field, in much worse conditions. It wasn't the protocol. It wasn't what any manual would prescribe. But the manual wasn't on that sofa, bleeding. "I'm going to need your authorization," she said. He frowned slightly, not understanding. "My type is the same as yours. I'm going to do a direct collection. Small, enough to stabilize. You need to agree." There was a pause. He looked at her in a different way now, no longer with that calculated assessment she had perceived from the start, but with something she would only later recognize as genuine surprise. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. It was a simple question, and she didn't have an elaborate answer. There were practical answers, of course, because it was the decision that would keep him stable until dawn, because it was what she knew how to do, because abandoning him now would be both a technical and a human failure. But there was also something she didn't say, because when she looked at him, she saw a man who was using all the reserves he had left not to collapse, and that she recognized with a precision that didn't come from books. "Because it's what needs to be done," she replied. He nodded, a minimal movement as if agreeing cost him something. She went to the refrigerator and drank a large glass of sugar water, ate the yogurt she had thought about on the way home, and returned with the material. The procedure took a little over 20 minutes. She worked with her arm extended and her eyes on the improvised monitor she had set up with the oximeter from the kit, watching his signs stabilize gradually while her own head began to feel slightly light, which was expected and manageable. When she finished, he was already breathing more regularly. The paleness was still there, but it had receded a step. She stood up slowly, went to the kitchen, drank another glass of water, and spent a few minutes leaning against the counter, looking at the ceiling of an apartment that suddenly had another human being inside. When she returned to the living room, he had closed his eyes, but before she thought he had fallen asleep, he spoke, with a voice hoarser and lower than before. "Thank you." She didn't respond. She turned off the floor lamp, left only the small hallway light on, and went to the bedroom, where she lay down with her clothes still damp and stared at the ceiling for a time she couldn't measure. Outside, São Paulo continued its distant and constant noise, indifferent to the fact that on that night, in that Sumaré apartment, two people who should never have crossed paths had exchanged something that neither of them yet knew how to name. When Mariana woke up, the light coming through the crack in the blinds had the white, cold quality of a morning that was already advanced. She looked at the clock on her cell phone. 8:42. She had slept less than 6 hours, but her head was surprisingly clear in that way that happens when the body understands it cannot afford the luxury of being slow. She got up and went to the living room. The sofa was empty. She stood still at the entrance of the room for a moment, looking at the space where she had left the man hours before. The pillow she had placed under his head was folded over the arm of the sofa with a precision that was not carelessness. The used gauzes were not on the floor. The room was exactly as it should be, as if the entire night had been an elaboration of exhausted sleep. Except for the envelope on the coffee table. It was a plain white envelope, the kind bought at any stationery store downtown. Inside was a sheet folded in 3, and when she opened it, she found a 4-line letter with a precise and angular handwriting that matched everything she had observed about the man without knowing she was observing it. The letter said, "You did for me what no one else would. There is not enough gratitude for what I received tonight. I hope this covers the costs and the inconvenience. Be well." There was no signature. Mariana folded the letter and placed it on the table. Then she saw what was under the envelope, which she had displaced without realizing when she picked up the paper. It was a stack of folded bills. She opened them, counted them mentally, and stared at the amount for an unnecessarily long time. It was an amount that corresponded to almost 3 of her salaries, in cash. Left on the coffee table of a Sumaré apartment at 8 in the morning by a stranger who had disappeared without making a sound. She placed the money back on the table as if it were something very hot. She prepared coffee, took a shower, changed clothes, and sat in the kitchen for 40 minutes doing nothing but drinking coffee and looking out the window. Then she called the hospital and informed them she would arrive late. She gave no explanation, which was unusual for her, but the supervisor did not press. She returned to the living room. The money was still there. In the next 3 days, Mariana tried to resume her rhythm with the obstinacy of someone who knows that routine is a form of healing. She went to the hospital, fulfilled her shifts, ate at the right times, slept enough. The money stayed on the table, then went into the cabinet drawer, then returned to the top of the table because keeping it seemed like a decision she wasn't yet ready to make. The letter stayed inside her bag, in the smaller zippered pocket, without her being able to explain why. What she couldn't stop feeling was his gaze. Not the gaze of the wounded, vulnerable, dependent man. The gaze from before that, at the moment he had asked why she was doing that. There was in that gaze a quality of someone who had spent a lot of time in the world, without finding answers to certain questions, and had reached the conclusion that answers did not exist. And then she appeared and did the simplest thing possible, which was simply helping. and that had destabilized some calculation he had made about how people function. She thought about this while checking a dressing, while waiting for the elevator, while listening to the patient in bed 7 complain about the IV being cold. She thought about it with the irritation of someone who doesn't want to think about something and cannot stop. On Thursday, 4 days later, she left the hospital at 7 in the evening through a different entrance than usual because there was construction blocking access to the main parking lot. She was walking down the side corridor when she noticed there were 2 men on the sidewalk outside the glass who were not waiting for anyone and were not hospital employees. They were tall, wearing dark and discreet clothes, and were completely immobile in a way that anyone who works in emergency recognizes as active attention, not idleness. She slowed her pace without realizing it. One of them looked directly at her. Without threat, without gesturing, just a direct eye contact that lasted a second longer than normal. Then he lowered his eyes to his cell phone. Mariana kept walking, went out the side door, walked to the bus stop with her shoulders tense and her breathing a little shorter than it should be. She gave herself the benefit of the doubt during the entire journey. They were 2 men on a sidewalk. São Paulo had 8 million people. She was exhausted, and her imagination was contaminated by 4 days of unanswered questions. But when she arrived at her building and entered the elevator and the doors closed, she was left with the calm and absolutely groundless certainty that those men had seen her before she left the hospital, that they were waiting for her specifically, that the night in the alley had not ended yet. On Friday morning, Mariana went down to get the mail with her key in hand and found a man standing at the entrance of the building who was not waiting for the intercom. He was just there, as if the space belonged to him for some reason that didn't need to be explained. When she appeared, he straightened up slightly and said with a formal cordiality that sounded rehearsed without being false, "Good morning. Mr. Vasconcelos would like to talk to you." Mariana stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "Who is Mr. Vasconcelos?" The man replied that it was the man she had helped and said it with the same neutral tone of someone giving a protocol number. There was a car in the street waiting. She would be taken safely and brought back if she did not wish to stay. There was no obligation. Those were his words, word for word. Mariana stared at the car through the glass window of the entrance. It was black, discreet, of a model she wouldn't know how to name, but that clearly cost more than 2 years of her salary. The driver was immobile behind the steering wheel. She should have said no. She should have entered the elevator, gone up to the apartment, called someone, anyone, and told them what had happened 5 days before. She should have done many things that the theoretical version of herself would have done without hesitation. Instead, she went to the apartment, put away the mail key, grabbed her bag and jacket, and went down. The journey lasted 40 minutes, enough to cross a large part of the city toward a zone she knew by name but had never frequented. An area of Pinheiros that mixed renovated warehouses with high-end residences in one of those corners of São Paulo that the city had produced without planning, and that the market had transformed into something that cost a lot without appearing to have tried. The car stopped in front of a house that looked more like a renovated office, with discreet bars, an austere garden, and cameras she counted as she got out. 6, just on the side she could see. The man who had been at the building entrance accompanied her to the inner living room, which was large and sparsely furnished with a glass table, some chairs, and a window that looked out onto an inner courtyard with white pebbles and a single very tall tree whose name she didn't know. He was standing when she entered. He looked different from the last time she saw him. Obviously he did. Last time he was on the ground of an alley with 2 wounds and the color of someone who had lost more than they should. Now he wore simple dark clothing, was standing with the posture of someone who never needed to learn how to occupy a space because they always occupied it naturally, and there was a quality to the entire room that said that was the center of something, and that he was the center of that center. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It wasn't exactly a voluntary choice," she replied, and the honesty of the comment seemed to surprise him slightly, which she noticed because his eyes changed for an instant before returning to what they should be. "Sit down, please." She sat. He also sat on the other side of the glass table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was strange in a way she would only later understand. It was the silence of 2 people who already know more about each other than is reasonable for the time they have known each other. "My name is Rafael Vasconcelos," he said, and that was like a door opening to a room she didn't know existed. The name told her nothing immediately, but while he spoke, slowly and without ornament, about who he was and what he did, the image began forming with the inevitability of something that was already there before being named. Rafael Vasconcelos was responsible for a set of financial and logistical operations that crossed borders in ways that official documents did not describe with precision. There was a dispute with another family of equally vast interests, the Carano family, based in the interior of São Paulo, with ramifications throughout the supply chain that the two groups shared and that had become conflict territory. The night in the alley had been the result of this dispute coming closer than it should. He had been attacked by people in the service of the Caranos and had moved away from the group that night precisely so they wouldn't know where he was. He told all of this with the objectivity of someone who has already decided that the truth is more economical than the edited version. Mariana listened in silence. When he finished, she waited a few seconds before asking, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you know where my house is," he replied. "Because you carry a secret about me that you didn't ask to have. And because in 18 years of business, no one did for me what you did that night without asking for anything in return. And that puts me in a position I don't quite know how to manage." She looked at him. It was an honest answer in a way she didn't expect. "The money stayed in the drawer," she said. "I know," he replied. And there was something in the way he said it that confirmed what she had suspected. They knew a lot about her that she hadn't offered voluntarily. There was a part of her that should feel violated by that. But there was another part. The part that works 12 hours in emergency and learns to separate intention from consequence. That understood why. "You had me investigated," she said. Not as an accusation, just as confirmation of something she already knew. "Yes," he said. "I needed to know who the person was who had done that. If there was any interest behind it, any connection to the Caranos, anything that explained such an improbable choice. We found nothing. You are who you seem to be." Mariana stared at the tree in the courtyard for a moment. Then she turned to him again. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "you are in the middle of something you didn't ask to be in. And I need to ensure that this isn't going to cost you anything." In the next 10 days, Mariana's life acquired a new geometry that she hadn't chosen, and that strangely did not cause her the horror it should. She continued going to the hospital, fulfilling her shifts, answering the same questions from the same patients with the same precision as always. But there was now a car parked half a block from her building whenever she left, and a phone number saved in her contacts with the name R that she could call at any time, and a new and constant awareness of spaces, faces, and exits that she had acquired without realizing it. Raphael had been direct. As long as the impasse with the Caranos was not resolved, there was a risk. Not a large one, but existing. And he had not left an existing risk unattended in 18 years of business, and would not start now. She could refuse the protection. She could go to a relative's house if she wanted until things stabilized. But if she accepted continuing her own routine, there would be a discreet presence she wouldn't need to interact with. That wouldn't interfere with anything. That would be there only as a guarantee. She had accepted the discreet presence. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because there was, in the way he presented the situation, an honesty she found easier to deal with than the alternative of pretending nothing had changed. What she hadn't predicted was that she would also accept the lunches. It had started as a practical thing. She needed information about what was happening to be able to assess the risk realistically, and he had offered a short weekly meeting to update her. The first meeting happened at the Pinheiros house, lasted half an hour, was entirely about logistics, and she left with the sensation of having been treated like an adult, which was at once a simple thing and something that surprisingly didn't always happen. The second meeting happened at a small restaurant in Itaim, because the Pinheiros house was being used for another meeting that morning, and it lasted 2 hours, not entirely about logistics. She had asked at a moment when the conversation had paused naturally regarding the conflict with the Caranos, "How long have you been doing this?" And he had replied since he was 22, and there was a brevity in the answer that contained a weight she recognized. She didn't press, but he continued as if the question had uncapped something that had been under pressure for a long time. He spoke about his father, who had built the business on the edge of the legal and what was not. in a time when that frontier was more fluid. He spoke about his younger brother, Henrique, who had been the only one who understood why he stayed, and who had died 2 years ago in a car accident on a road in the interior, that Raphael visited mentally every time the tension got too high. He spoke about the weight of being responsible for a set of things, and people whose size had grown beyond what any young version of himself would have imagined carrying. He didn't romanticize anything. He didn't ask for absolution. He was a man who had made choices and knew he had made them, and there was something in that absence of a victim narrative that Mariana found harder to ignore than if he had tried to justify himself. "You never wanted to leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Wanting is not the issue. The issue is what you owe to the people who depend on what you built. What decision do you make when leaving means that everything you raised collapses onto those who stayed?" She understood that. Not as an abstract concept, but in a concrete way. There were patients in the beds, families in waiting rooms, a team that functioned because there was someone holding the structure. The scale was different. The logic was similar. In the 3rd week, she was called urgently to a different house in a gated community in Cotia, because there was movement from the Carranos near her street, and Raphael's team had assessed that it was safer to take her out of the apartment for 48 hours. She went, took her computer, a book, and her work bag, and spent the 48 hours between video calls with the hospital and conversations on the porch with Raphael, who was there during both nights. It was on the 2nd night, after a dinner she had helped prepare because inactivity drove her crazy, that he said something that changed the weight of the air between them. He was washing the dishes, and she was drying, and he said without preamble, "You aren't afraid of me." She thought for a moment. "It's not that I'm not," she replied. "It's that the fear I have of you isn't the same one other people have." He looked at her sideways. "How so?" "They're afraid of what you can do. I'm afraid of what I've already done," she said, and there was a slight smile on the edge of it that he took a moment to understand. After understanding, he did something she hadn't seen in him yet. He laughed, a brief, real sound that lasted less than 2 seconds, but that completely changed the contour of his face. She saved that laugh the way one saves things one knows will be needed later. When she returned to the Soumare apartment, the money was still in the drawer. She took it out, put it in an envelope, and took it to the hospital with the intention of depositing it in the medication fund that the team maintained for patients without coverage. But before leaving, she stared at the envelope in her bag for a full minute, and the feeling she felt was not of a debt paid. It was of something that was still open, that still didn't have a name, that she was starting to want it to have. The negotiation proposal with the Carranos arrived on a Sunday afternoon. Raphael called her with a voice that was in the same tone as always, that tone that had learned to function regardless of what was happening underneath, and said there was a meeting scheduled for the following week at a neutral property in Campinas that both parties had agreed to use. The objective was to end the impasse definitively. If it went well, the pressure on everyone would cease in a matter of days. "If it goes well," he repeated, and there was in those 3 words an ambiguity she didn't ask about at that moment, but that lingered. In the 2 days before the meeting, he was different. Not radically, not in a way that any person would see without knowing him, but she had learned to read the blank spaces in Rafael Vasconcelos's communication with a precision that surprised her when she stopped to notice. He was more contained, more methodical, responding to her messages with the same speed as always, but with a weight less in the words, like someone who is saving energy for something that is going to need a lot of it. On the afternoon before the meeting, he appeared at her apartment without warning in advance, which was unusual. He had a small backpack that he left at the entrance without explanation and went straight to the living room window, looking at the street for a few moments before turning around. "If something doesn't go as planned tomorrow," he said, "you will be contacted by Marcos, who is the man responsible for ensuring you return to your routine without complications." Mariana was sitting on the sofa with a book she had stopped reading 3 paragraphs ago. She looked at him. "You're telling me this because you think something might go wrong," she said. "I'm telling you because it's the information you need to have." There was a difference between those 2 things, and both knew it. She set the book aside. "Raphael, what exactly is happening with this meeting?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the chair opposite the sofa and sat down, which was a small gesture but meant he had decided to continue being honest, which was the pattern they had established between themselves without ever naming it. The Caranos agreed to the meeting too quickly, he said. There is an analysis within my team that it might be a move to place us in a space they control more than the neutral one we are assuming. We have no way of knowing for sure. But there is a scenario where the meeting is not the ending, it's a well-packaged trap. And you are going anyway, she said. Not going would be the same as admitting a retreat I cannot make right now. It would have consequences that would affect people beyond me. She stared at him. It was a formulation she recognized because it was the same logic of staying that he had described weeks before, the logic of the weight of other people on one's own decisions. And there was a part of her that wanted to say that this wasn't reasonable, that there were smarter ways to resolve it, that he was being stubborn in a way that was actually fear disguised as responsibility. But there was another part of her, the part that knew him now in a way she hadn't planned to know him, that understood that sometimes a person reaches a point where the only thing they have intact is the way they decide to act, and that taking that away from them would be taking away more than the decision itself. Then tell me one thing, she said, and there was a different quality in her voice now that he noticed because he became even quieter. What do you want, Raphael? Not what needs to be done. What do you want? The question hung in the air for a time that was larger than its physical size. He said, I want this to end. I want to be able to have a conversation in a restaurant without mapping the exits. I want to sleep without waking up with the phone in my hand. And more, she said. She had learned to push his blank spaces. He looked at her for a long moment. And more, he said, I want to stop calculating what I should and shouldn't feel when I'm near you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people recognize at the same time something that both knew but neither had said. Mariana got up from the sofa, went to where he was and stood in front of him. He looked up. There was in him at that moment something she rarely saw in adults, an openness without defense, a place where absolute control had paused by its own choice. She said, Come back from there. And there was in those 3 words everything she didn't say. Everything both knew was being said. He stayed with her until late, but did not spend the night. Before leaving, he stopped at the door, turned one last time, and looked at her with an expression she would later try to describe to herself and wouldn't be able to, because it was an expression that contained too many things at once. Gratitude, anticipation, something that in another man, in other circumstances, she would call fear, and a kind of determination that seemed to have been renewed by that night. Mariana closed the door and stood in the hallway of her own apartment for a long time, with her hands in her pants pockets and her head absolutely quiet in a way that was the opposite of empty. It was that stillness that happens when a person finally stops fighting against what they already know is true. The call arrived at 14 hours and 23 minutes the following afternoon. Mariana was at the hospital, in the interval between procedures with a cup of coffee in her hand and her cell phone on the break room counter, when she saw the unknown number on the screen. She answered because she had learned in recent weeks that unknown numbers could be important in ways her previous life had not prepared her to evaluate. The voice on the other side was masculine, calm, with an interior accent she identified but couldn't place exactly. He said her name, correct and complete, which was the first thing that made the cup feel heavier in her hand. Then he said that Mr. Vasconcelos was fine, but that there was a situation that needed her participation to be resolved. He said he knew she was at the Hospital das Clínicas, that the meeting in Campinas had taken a different turn than planned, and that if she wanted to know more, she should come alone to an address in the dry port of Santo André. She asked who she was speaking to. The man said his own name as if it were something she should recognize, Augusto Carano. Mariana stood absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then she said, What do you want? What I want, he said, is a conversation with the nurse who saved Rafael Vasconcelos. He is fine and will stay that way. But I would like to speak with you personally before deciding the next step. Come alone, without informing anyone who works for him. I give you 2 hours. The call ended. She stared at the cell phone for a time she couldn't measure. Then she did what she always did whenever she needed to think clearly. She went to the sink, turned on the cold tap, placed both hands under the water for 15 seconds. The habit had started at 24, during a shift when there were 2 polytrauma patients at the same time, and she had needed something concrete and immediate to organize the internal chaos before acting. It always worked. She knew that was a trap. The word trap existed specifically for situations where you know the obvious decision is dangerous, and you go toward it anyway because the cost of not going is greater. And the cost of not going was Rafael Vasconcelos in a situation she couldn't imagine clearly, but that Augusto Carrano had described as resolvable through her presence. She evaluated the options with the speed of someone who for 12 years has evaluated crisis situations in real time. She could call Marcos, as Rafael had instructed, but that would probably accelerate something she didn't control. She could not go, but then she wouldn't know what was happening on the other side. She could go and treat it as what it probably was. A conversation someone wanted to have with her because they had realized she was relevant to Rafael in a way that went beyond obligation. Nurses make impossible decisions every night on duty. The difference is, they usually have more information. She went. The dry port of Santo Andre was in an industrial area that São Paulo had produced and then forgotten in favor of other regions, a set of warehouses and container yards that functioned with that logic of zones that no one inhabits, but everyone uses. The GPS took her through a route that left the radial Lesti and entered a nameless stretch she wouldn't have found without help. The Uber stopped at a corner, and the driver said he didn't recognize the more specific address, and she got out and walked the rest. The warehouse indicated by the number Carrano had mentioned had its side door open. There were 2 men outside who looked at her when she arrived but did not stop her. Inside, the space was vast and poorly lit, with the characteristic smell of oil and metal that she would associate with that place forever after. Rafael was sitting in a steel chair near the center of the warehouse, his wrists fastened behind his back, with a plastic zip tie, but physically intact, as had been promised. When he saw her, the expression that passed through his face was one of the most complex things she had observed in another human being. It was at once relief and horror, and the horror wasn't for himself, it was for her. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," she replied. Augusto Carrano emerged from the back of the warehouse. He was a man of 60, older than she expected, with the appearance of a successful interior businessman, which she imagined was exactly the intention. He was in a blazer and carried a glass of water, as if he were in a business meeting, which in a way he was. "Thank you for coming," he said, with a cordiality that wasn't affectation. It was something more disconcerting. It was genuine. "I wanted to meet you. The woman Rafael Vasconcelos cannot stop protecting." He spent the next 10 minutes explaining, with the calmness of someone who has time and knows it, the nature of the conflict between the 2 families. It was a dispute that had begun as business and had become personal in the way all long disputes eventually do. But it had reached a point where continuing cost more than ending, and the Campinas meeting had been a genuine attempt at negotiation that had derailed because one of Rafael's men had reacted to a mistaken perception of a threat, and the environment had escalated quickly. "What I propose," said Carrano, "is simple. Rafael signs the agreement for the separation of routes that the legal team prepared. Each side keeps what is theirs. The matter is closed." Rafael from the chair said, "I already said I can review the agreement, but I need my lawyers present." Carrano nodded his head as if that were reasonable. Then he turned to Mariana. "And you," he said, "tell me something. Is the Rafael Vasconcelos you met in these last weeks the same one I have known for 20 years? It was a strange question. She stared at him. "Why does that matter?" she asked. "Because I need to know if he has changed," said Carrano with a simplicity that sounded true. 20 years of conflict destroy the ability to see the person on the other side with clarity. You saw him without that weight. So I ask." She looked at Rafael, who was looking back at her with an expression that asked for nothing, that left entirely to her the decision to answer or not. "He is the most honest man I have ever met," she said, "in the specific sense that he doesn't omit what he is, not to himself, nor to those he decides deserve to know." Carrano was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Send me the lawyers tomorrow." And that was how, in that warehouse smelling of metal and cold light, The war between the two families came to an end. Not with spectacle, not with greater drama than what already existed. With a question asked by a tired man, an answer given by a woman who had learned not to waste words, and the silent decision of two people on each side of an impasse to stop wasting time. When they released Raphael, he stood before her for an instant, looking as if he needed to confirm with his eyes what he already knew. Then he hugged her with a strength she didn't expect, and that said, without needing words, everything the man of controlled expression and measured voice had not yet found a way to say out loud. In the days that followed the afternoon in the Santo André warehouse, São Paulo continued being São Paulo, with its sovereign indifference and its constant background noise. The agreements were signed. The legal team worked for 48 hours and produced a document that no one would make a point of showing at a press conference, but that resolved, with the precision that paper manages to give to human things, what 20 years of friction had not managed to end. The car that used to park half a block from Mariana's building did not appear again starting Wednesday. She returned to the hospital's rhythm with a sensation that wasn't exactly relief and wasn't exactly a lack. It was more like the body after a long fever, functional, recognizable, but with the new awareness of how much effort it costs to maintain certain temperatures. Raphael called on Friday. He asked if she was okay. She said yes. He asked if he could stop by on Saturday. She said yes too, and this time there was no practical justification, no situation update, no agenda beyond the fact that she had said yes because she wanted to. He appeared at 10 in the morning with cheese bread from the oven and coffee he had bought at a bakery she didn't know, and which was, as she would discover later, the same bakery where his brother Henrique had worked for 2 years in Campinas before following another path. They sat in the kitchen, which was the room she used most naturally, and where she spoke with the least editing of herself, and the conversation went from one subject to another with the fluidity of conversations that do not need to justify their own existence. At some point between the second coffee and the afternoon that had arrived, without either of them having noticed the morning slip away, Raphael placed his cup on the table and stared at her for a time she didn't press. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The night you brought me here," he said, and there was a different quality in his voice, slower, as if he were being careful with every word. "In that early morning, when the color returned and I realized I had survived, the first thought I had was that I needed to know who you were, not for strategy, not for calculation. It was the first uncalculated thought I had had in years, and that scared me more than the wounds." She stayed quiet, listening. "When I had your life investigated," he continued, "I was trying to find a reason, an explanation that fit inside the logic I use to understand people. I didn't find one, and that was the second time you scared me without doing anything other than being who you are," Mariana said slowly. "And now you want to tell me what that scare means." He nodded, and then he said with the same objectivity he used to speak about agreements and logistics, but with a layer underneath that was the most real layer she had heard from him until then, that he had decided to start getting out. Not in an abrupt way, not with a rupture that would leave people without protection, but he had initiated conversations with the right people within his own structure for a transition that would take time, but that had, finally, begun. That her presence in all of that had been the catalyst not because she had asked or suggested, but because she had demonstrated, by the simplest example possible, that there were ways of being in the world that he had stopped believing existed for him. And that, he said, becoming quiet for an instant, there was something he needed to say that he didn't know how to say, with the elegance he would like, because it was an area where he had no practice, and that was simultaneously embarrassing and fair. Mariana said, "You can say it without elegance." He said, "You are the first person in many years with whom I don't count the time." It was a small sentence. It was a sentence that, coming from Rafael Vasconcelos, was one of the most open things he had said in his adult life. She knew that because she knew the proportion between what he said and what existed underneath. She said, "I don't count it either." There was a silence that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that has texture, that is made of things that people decide they no longer need to carry alone. Then she got up, went to the kitchen window, and looked at the street for a moment. Outside, a dog crossed the sidewalk with that urgency of destination that dogs have, and a child on top of a bicycle passed by, laughing at something no one else saw. São Paulo continued its parallel and constant life, indifferent and vast, as always. She turned and looked at him from where she was. "You're going to be able to do this," she said. "Get out. I'm not saying it's going to be simple, because I know you enough to know you're going to make complicated what could be more direct. But you'll manage." He looked at her with an expression that contained, this time, something she recognized without needing to name, because it is too rare in adults to have many synonyms. It was hope. Not the performative hope of someone who believes everything will work out, but the harder hope, the one that appears when a person isn't sure of the result, but decides to trust anyway. "You're going to help me?" he asked. And it was a real question, not rhetorical, and she knew that the answer she gave at that moment would be one of those that stay. She said, "I already am helping, since the night you were on the ground of an alley and had no reason to trust me." He stared at her for another moment. Then, for the second time since she had known him, he laughed, but this time it was different from the night in Kotia. This time the laugh lasted longer, had more room to exist, and there was in it a lightness she understood to be new. Not the lightness of someone who is relieved, but the lightness of someone who decided, once and for all, to stop being so heavy with themselves. She returned to the table, picked up the cup. The coffee was already cold, and neither of them made a point of heating it. 6 months after that morning of cheese bread and cold coffee, Mariana Fontes married Rafael Vasconcelos in a ceremony that took place at a farm in Itatiba, in the Serra da Cantareira, on an afternoon with a very blue sky that the interior of São Paulo produces in winter, as if it were compensation for the smoke and concrete of the cities. There were 42 people. No long speeches, no stage musicians, no dessert table too elaborate to be real. There were wildflowers on the tables, a wine that one of Raphael's collaborators had cultivated for 8 years in a valley in São Roque, and the delegation from Clínicas that appeared with the supervisor in front, and a toast that led 5 people to discreetly wipe their eyes. The ring he placed on her finger was old, a family heirloom, with a gold setting that had spent decades in a safe in a house in the interior of Minas that had belonged to his grandfather. He had had it cleaned but not renovated. It was important to him that the marks of time remained visible. After the ceremony, when most people had already left, and the two remained sitting on the farm's porch, looking at the hills that were slowly darkening, she asked, "Are you okay?" He waited a moment before responding. Then he said, "I am in something better than okay. I am in something that didn't have a name before." She understood. It was the same thing she had felt since that night of rain in Sumare, which had begun as an impulse of compassion without calculation, and had revealed itself with time, and with the slow accumulation of conversations and silences, and difficult choices and cold coffees, as the thing that changes the axis of a life. Raphael's transition out of his previous activities was happening slowly, as she had predicted. There was resistance, there were negotiations, there were days when he arrived with a closed face, and she knew not to ask yet, to wait for the exhaustion to find a way to speak for itself. But there was also a growing lightness, a new quality in the way he occupied spaces, as if it were possible, at 42 years old, to learn to set down the weight and discover that the feet still support the body without it. She continued at Clínicas. There was no reason to stop. The work was what it was, essential and exhausting, and full of moments that didn't fit into words. Some nights she left through the side door with her feet aching inside her white sneakers, and stopped for an instant on the sidewalk, looking at the wet or dry street, and thought about the version of herself from a few months ago who had entered an alley because she heard a groan and couldn't keep walking. No part of her would change that decision. Love had not arrived with fanfare. It had arrived the way it arrives when two people standing still make the choice, each for their own reason and at the same time, to lower the defenses that kept the world at a safe distance. And there was a strange justice in that the person who had learned to control everything had found in someone who had learned to trust the uncontrollable a place to rest. On that porch in Itatiba, with the valley darkening slowly and the first crickets beginning their count, Raphael took her hand without looking, like someone picking up something that has been theirs for a long time. She let him. They stayed that way, in silence, for a long time that neither of them counted. San Paulo was an hour from there. It continued doing what it always did, changing shifts, replacing one movement with another, hosting millions of parallel stories without knowing about any of them. Somewhere in the city, on a sidewalk in Sumare, or in an alley that the rain washed from time to time, the night that had started everything was stored as things are stored that needed to happen so that others could. And if there is a truth in this story, it is this, that kindness done without calculation and without a guarantee of return is not naivety. It is the most precise act a human being can practice, because it changes what it touches, and sometimes it changes it forever. Dear person who is listening to this now, thank you for staying until the end. The story of Mariana and Rafael did not exist until you decided to hear it, and that is what makes it real. If something in this narrative touched you, whether it was the courage of a simple gesture, the weight of a man learning to trust, or simply the idea that two worlds that should never meet can build something true, then it fulfilled what it came to do. Every week we bring stories like this, which inhabit the border between what is improbable and what is human. To not miss any of them, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because each new story is a conversation worth having. If this one moved you, leave a like, which is the simplest way to say it was worth it. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever done something for a stranger that changed the course of something without you being able to predict it? We read everything. Until the next story. End of story.